All right. If anyone's watching the live stream, you do have to be present to win. So sorry if you get pulled. All right. So have our list of names for people that RSVP'd for tonight. So if you didn't RSVP, sorry, it's too late. I'll go ahead and pick the first winner. Rahul, are you here? If person's not present, we're just going to skip to the next person. All right, congratulations. All right, let's pick prize winner number 2. Ania, are you here? All right. It's a shame. Shame for RSVPing and not showing up. All right, we'll pick someone else just got lucky, so we're going to pick them. Scott Youngers. Shame. Come on. All right. Lance, are you here? No? List of shame grows. All right. Altamir. Congratulations. Thank you, SDG, for giving those tickets out. It's very awesome of you. All right, so let me just switch back here to back to where I was. Now, another note about Open Source North is we're going to have a booth there for Angular and set up along with a bunch of the other Twin Cities meetups. So you'll see me there for sure, and maybe one of the other organizers. Okay, so what's next? Special giveaway. Hiring, looking for work. We do this every time. If there's anyone hiring, now is a good time to have a platform to get up and announce. A lot of the core members are developers, so it's a good place to advertise your job listings. Anybody? Okay, what about looking for hire? The other one, the first stab, so the first one. Anybody? Okay, we'll just get on to it. So, as always, we do our call for presenters. I do believe we have someone lined up for next month. And I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be out of town. One of our other organizers will be here. So if you have a presentation that you would like to give, we have a message board on our meetup.com/Angular event that you can go to and post a title and a small description of your talk, and we'll get you queued up in one of our future meetups. And other announcements, that's you guys. Anyone else have an announcement they'd like to give Angular related? So we'll just get right to lightning talks. When we have a lightning talk, we do these kind of impromptu. If you have something cool, you want to look at your laptop and share it with everyone. If not, bring it for next time. And we do this every month. So anyone have a lightning talk they'd like to give, and if not, then we'll just get into Chris Thielen's talk. I don't hear anything, so Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah.
Another thing we're doing different this month, we're going to do a screen share of the presenter screen so we have a better live stream experience. So just give me a second. I got to switch things over to Chris. And then we'll proceed. Okay, so right now, Chris, I see your webcam.
Oh.
So
share my screen.
Chris is going to do. There we go. I will then mute my microphone.
Okay, and I am unmuted.
My microphone is muted, so you should be good to go.
Hopefully the people on the internet can hear us.
So once you get going, I'll go run the other room.
Sounds good.
Make sure we're getting audio.
So how many of us here have heard of the new Angular 1.5 component method? Okay, fair amount. That's good. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. If I can figure out how to present my slides. All right. So the Angular 1.5 component method is a new thing in Angular 1.5 that allows us to write components in a way that encapsulates the template and the controller together as a single unit. Very similar to the way that we have already been able to do using directives, but with some key advantages. So a little background. In the beginning, when Angular first came around, we had HTML tags, we had scope that we could put our data on, we had ng controller where we could put some logic that manages the data on our scope. We could bind that to the tag. Then we had some advancements. We could do like ng include. We could pull things from external templates and that kind of stuff. And that was fine. And then directives came around. Directives kind of helped us to encapsulate some of the different things that are part of the template, controller, the data, all that kind of stuff. So a directive kind of helps us encapsulate all that kind of stuff. It has template and a controller. Scope, have a few different settings for scope. Scope true, scope false, isolate scope. An isolate scope is like this special thing where it's kind of in the scope tree, but it's not really in there. Otherwise, you can just pull stuff off of the parent scope. We had this thing called restrict where you could say it can only be used as a comment or a class name or a tag or an element or any of those combinations. We had this thing called require, which allows you to communicate with some other directive, maybe that's somewhere else in the application, above it or on the same tag. Then we had, as part of the API, we have compile, we have controller, we have link, which has a pre and a post link. We have controller as, and it just got really complicated and messy. As well as bind and controller, which has two different styles. One which takes a Boolean and one which takes an object. So directives are great, but they can be really complicated and messy. So enter the component method. In Angular 1.5, they introduced this component, which is essentially a collection of reasonable defaults to use with a directive. And the API for it is a template, a control. Oh gosh. You guys.
We thought you were just doing a great job.
Oh man. Oh my gosh. Let me see. Present. Start presentation. You go over there. I don't know where my mouse is. Okay. We got this. No problem. Close that window. And then open my other one. Aha! This is not right. Okay, we're going to go over to here. And we're going to step through it. All right. So this component method has four things on it. It has a template, has a controller, it has bindings, and it has require. Now the template and the controller we're all very familiar with. The HTML, tags, etc. The component method always uses controller as. So I'm sure you're familiar with controller as. It basically means that you put all of your data and your functions for the controller onto the controller instance itself, and then you refer to it via some name within the template. In the Angular 1.5 component world, that name is always $CTRL by default. So you'll see that coming up in code on the internet, a lot of $CTRL dot something. So you'll see it as like binding to data using control.total. And that's the default. You can't override that, but that is the default. So if we look at, can you guys see that at all? That's not helping. So I'm sorry that it's kind of small. It's smaller than I was hoping. But if you look in the foo list template there, we have a list of foos that's coming off of $control.foo. $control is the controller as, .foo is the data that's on that controller instance, and we're looping over that, and we're spitting out the name and the cost. And then down below, we have total cost. It says control.total. So again, the data sits on the controller. In the controller function, that's essentially a constructor, we have, we're setting this.total based on this.foos, and we're just adding everything up and generating the total and then spitting it out onto the controller object. And then here's where we declare our component, register it with Angular so that we can use it in a template. That's at the bottom. It says, or near the bottom, it says module.component foo list, and then we have just an object. With a directive, you would have a function, a factory function that generates the object. They got rid of that. It's just an object, a little bit simpler. And we have the template, we have the controller, and we have bindings. Now, bindings are a way to get data in and out of the component. So a binding allows us to pass the data into the component from the parent via an attribute. And you can see that at the bottom. It says foo list foos equals control.data.foos, and foos is mapping to the bindings declaration. It says bindings foo. I don't know, can you guys see that at all? A little bit? Okay, good.
Full screen your slides that now.
What's that?
Go to presentation mode on slides.com.
I'm not seeing it.
There's a button over right there.
See, my mouse is delayed on there, so I'm really having trouble. Oh, that's YouTube, isn't it?
What is it?
That's YouTube, yeah.
Oh, well, at least that's not listed.
That's a good point. That's on that one over there. Can you push that? Yes. Did you push it?
I'm viewing the screencast of myself too.
Oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on. This is the first time we've done this setup, so apologize for that. So what? So what's the point of all of this? Well, number one, we've got a set of best practices that we've kind of learned over the years in developing Angular, and the community as a whole has kind of come to component as the basic building block of an application. And so using the .component method allows us to buy into that paradigm and build our application as components and components and components. Another benefit of it is that we have fewer choices. You saw all that stuff in the directive API. We don't need to necessarily pick all of that all the time. So this is it's reducing the complexity. It's reducing the cognitive load that you have to know in order to develop in Angular. Another thing that it does is it encapsulates our logic and our template together into a single unit that we can then think of as a single thing. In a lot of apps, it's difficult to know where the data is coming from. It's difficult to know who owns the data and that sort of thing. With the encapsulated template and controller, it's much easier to reason about that. Another benefit is we have much less boilerplate that we have to maintain. The API is much simplified, so there's just less code to write. Another benefit is that we have well-defined inputs and outputs. So if a component takes data, it's going to have a binding that's an input binding. And then you know where that data came from, because in the template, you can see that it was passed in as an attribute to that component instance. The same way, Events going out, we didn't really talk about this, but you can declare an event. When somebody clicks a button in your component, for instance, you can declare binding. It's very similar to a directive, and it will call whatever the parent wired up as that binding callback. And again, it helps to well define that, having that in a simple API. Another thing is that we try to only modify our own data, the data that we, as a component, actually are the primary owner of. And one-time binding, sorry, that should be one-way binding. We're not actually passing changes in the component back up to the parent, whoever passed that data in. We're not two-way binding it. We're just doing a one-way binding. Another thing that it helps, another benefit is that it helps us avoid scope abuse, like scope soup, where we just grab things out of thin air and hope they're there. Hope somebody didn't take them out of this other component and they just disappeared. And finally, the lifecycle hooks that are available on a component closely mimic the lifecycle hooks that are available in an Angular 2 component. So this helps us to reason about our Angular 1 apps in a manner that is much closer to the way that we'll develop Angular 2 apps, if that makes sense. And the final benefit is its components all the way down. So you can think about your application as just a series, a hierarchy, a component tree. And it really clears up the cognitive overload that you have of trying to reason about a large Angular app. I think that's all I have for the Angular 1.5 components. Any questions on that?
I have kind of two questions.
Yeah.
I saw in the directive binding for the component, there was like a greater than symbol. And that one is new to me, so I don't know if that's new to .5 or.
That is new. Yes. Oh, did I pass it? Yeah, that is definitely new, and that it's a less than symbol, and what that stands for is one-way binding. So it's the binding of the data only goes from the parent into the child. The child, it doesn't watch that data in the child. So that's the difference. Where are you looking? Right down, right here, where we've got the bindings, foo's, colon, and then the string less than.
And that might kind of tie into my second question there.
Sure.
With the component kind of having a one-way binding. I'm pretty familiar with a directive kind of having a two-way binding, even with isolate scope, where I could pass some scope data into my directive and kind of watch it change within the directive and then the parent scope.
Yes.
So would that kind of by default would not be possible with the component, if I understand correctly?
Okay, so there's a caveat here. The caveat is that you're still passing the object reference down into that component. So if you make changes on there, it is going to update that. It's just not, it doesn't do an Angular watch. It doesn't do a $watch on it. And they want to encourage us not to do that. They want to encourage us to make a copy of it in the component so you have your own data that's owned by you. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you then bind functions? Like one thing you could do with the isolate scope is bind callbacks.
Correct. Yes, and that's the same.
And that's the same. Okay.
So you can use the ampersand as a binding, like foo callback, colon, ampersand, and that ampersand will create a function binding.
Okay.
And that's, the key thing to understand here is Angular 1.5 dot component is just sugar for a reasonable set of defaults for a directive. Under the covers, it actually creates a directive. Any other questions? Yeah, you can. What you do in the template is you would just put, what are we working with, foos or bars? We're working with foo, so we just put a bar element in the template for the foo component. We might repeat over a list. We then do an ng repeat on the bars. If that makes sense.
And you can pass variables, input variables into the chat.
Yep, you can pass variables, callbacks. It's all, and that's what when I say it's components all the way down, that's what I'm talking about. So
Similar to Angular 2.
exactly, very similar to Angular 2. Yep. And that's kind of the point of the component method, is to be similar to Angular 2. So that, well, we'll get into that.
So one more question.
One more question.
The one-way binding going down.
Yeah.
It's the data flows down. I said it's a one-time binding. If the parent changes it, do I see the change?
I put one time on there, but it was a typo. It's one way.
One
So,
way, I'm
yep.
sorry.
So it is
So the
updated.
parent changes it, the data still flows down.
That's correct.
If I want to change it, I send an event up.
That's correct.
Ask them to change it.
Yep, you got it. Any other questions? All right, let's see if I can figure this out. I'd like to do the next presentation in presentators mode because I have notes. So the next presentation, as I'm sure you know, is about migrating a UI router application, I'll get there, to Angular 2. What's the hotkey for full screen?
Are you using Spectrum?
I got it. Woohoo! And I got my notes. All right. And you guys get to see my notes. I don't know why. So tonight we are going to talk about migrating a UI router application from Angular 1 to Angular 2. Some of you may know me. My name is Chris Thielen. I am a senior software engineer here at Virtual. And I'm also one of the core contributors to the UI router project. I also have a side project that I talked about a year and a half ago called UI router extras that adds some additional functionality to UI router. So we have lots of material to cover. I have a lot of code samples. And at any point, if you want to dig in a little bit deeper, just stop me and say you want to look at some real code. I got some real code. Tell me they're not out of sync. Oh, they're out of sync. Oh, I'm sorry. So, UI router. I can do this. UI router has kind of been considered the de facto standard for routing in Angular 1. And I'd like to see a show of hands who has heard of UI router. Okay, good. That's probably why you're here. Who has used UI router. That's great. And who here has a UI router app that you want to upgrade to NG2 or are thinking about it? Move the whole thing. Yep. Yeah. So let's see. UI router at its core is it thinks of software in terms of a state machine. So it's based on a state machine. It's not really what you would call a true state machine because we have states, but we don't really control the edges. So any state can navigate to any other state. And that's a little bit different from a finite state machine. You would typically have, or not a finite state machine, but a regular application state machine, you would have vertices and nodes, and you would have a well-defined set of transitions from one node to another node. We don't do any of that. We just say if you're on a node, you can transition to any other node, or at least you can try to do that. It may or may not work. Let's see. Bear with me here. I'm still struggling a little bit. Oh, good. This is going to work. So because we model our application as a tree of states, and this is going to sound very familiar because I just said that our components are a tree of components. And in Angular 2, they'll talk about that as well. You've got this tree of components. Well, we model our application as a tree, and then we map that to the components. So it's a little bit different than the Angular 2 approach, where the component tree is the application structure. In UI router, the application structure drives the component tree, if that makes sense. And the reason for that is we have like named views, and you can, if you go to a place in your tree, you can say, I want that view that's outside of my tree to change with this, this component. That makes UI router, the state machine aspect also, we consider a transition to be essentially atomic. So if you want to go from one point in your application to another point in your application, it might be traversing a whole bunch of steps in that component tree. We consider that to essentially be an atomic operation. Now that's a bit of an exaggeration because we're not like a database. You know, we're not doing whatever, I forget what the acronym is, but we're not really atomic, but we're pretty close. We're promise-based. And because of that, either the entire transition succeeds or the entire transition fails. One of those two things is going to happen. And that allows us to provide a little bit more robustness to your application, because you're not going to get stuck in like an in-between state. It's either going to happen or it's not. Another thing about UI router, the way that we have our state trees are, it offers some flexibility to the application. These transitions, they are atomic, and they have a life cycle. They have a start, they have prep, they have intermediate phases, they have a finish phase, and then they have like, they're completed. And you can hook into any of those life cycle events, and you can do things. You can hook into those, and that allows you to essentially create application behaviors in a very declarative way. And I'll show you what I mean about that later. What does that say? Yes, and we have lots of existing applications in the wild, and that's why I went through the trouble of doing this presentation, getting the code to work, so that all these application developers in the wild can upgrade to Angular 2. So what do we need? We need a migration plan. Angular 1 and Angular 2 are very similar in concept in that you've got components, you've got code that manages those components, you've got data, you've got services that kind of sit outside of there, you have dependency injection. So at a very conceptual level, they're pretty close to the same conceptual framework. However, they're very different in terms of how they implement that. NG2, Angular 2, is a ground-up rewrite. I don't know. I don't think they even shared any code. It doesn't even look close to the same. And NG1 and NG2 both tied to their implementation details pretty heavily. So we need a plan. We need to figure out how to do this. I skipped a whole section. I'm going to go back. So Angular 2 is currently being quite hyped. It's the next big thing. It's components all the way down, as we said. Has much better dependency injection. Left behind a whole bunch of bad architecture. It left behind the inherited and isolated scope. It left behind the config and runtime aspects of providers. It left behind the nobody else does it dependency injection system. The DI system in Angular 2 was a good thing at the time because there wasn't any other way to do it back then, to do dependency injection with modules. Now it's just, we have ES6 modules, we have all sorts of solutions that we can use. And currently the Angular dependency injection module system is just getting in the way. I shouldn't say dependency injection, I should focus on the module system is probably getting in the way. They got rid of the differences between constant value, factory, and service, and they got rid of the inconsistent template binding where you're not sure if that thing that you're passing in there is a string or if it's actually going to be interpolated. They got rid of the digest loop / $apply where you have to call $apply if you get into jQuery and like all this stuff. So Angular 2 is currently in beta. Beta 13 I think is the latest. They have a roadmap. You can see it here. Shoot. They have a roadmap, I swear. They're talking about the road to release candidate, and it looks like that there's a milestone on the Angular / Angular repository. It's like 35% complete, and it's been moving along. And if that's any indicator, it's going to be like another 3-4 months before a release candidate. Component router is optional. It's not a part of core Angular. And as far as the community is concerned, there's been, it's not quite up to par. I'm getting there. So that's where hopefully that we can kind of fill that gap, UI router, and offer our different perspective and get people up and running with Angular 2 with a router that they really enjoy using. We're currently in alpha. We're hoping to get to a release candidate around the same time as Angular 2 gets to their release candidate. So it's coming up here pretty quickly. Can't tell which screen I'm on. This is really frustrating. Migration plan. We just talked about this, right? So we need to plan. That's the long and short of it. So our plan looks like this. First thing we're going to do is we're going to update UI router to whatever the latest version is, 1.0 something. 1.0 has been in development for, I hate to say this, but it's been about 2 years. And we are getting really, really close, and it's looking really good. I'm kind of excited about it. So the first step of our plan is to update UI router. Second step of our plan is to migrate to NG1 components. Has anybody ever heard of a component method in NG1? Angular 1.5? Yeah, that's great. The next step is to introduce Angular 2 into the mix. So we've got our Angular 1.5 application. We've done a bunch of refactoring, and now we have this tree of components, and it's fantastic. Now we're going to add Angular 2 into the mix. The next step is to add these upgraded adapters. There's a couple of upgraded adapters that I'll talk about, one that Angular 2 provides and one that UI routers provide. And then we are going to migrate our services to Angular 2, and then we're going to migrate our components to Angular 2. So the second step, migrating to NG1 components, that's a stepping stone to our final goal. We're reorganizing our application so that it is congruous with the mental approach for Angular 2. So we're kind of just going to make it kind of feel a little bit more like Angular 2 feels. Let's see if I have any other notes in here. So the two adapters, one is Angular/upgrade, and that's in the Angular 2 repository. It's not part of core, but it's in the core repository. So you don't pull it in if you're doing a build, but you can. The other one is called UI router-ng1 to ng2. And the final step, after we've done all these things, is to remove Angular 1. So when can we do this stuff? Well, you can do that right now. You can upgrade to UI router 1.0. You can start using UI router 1.0's route to component. You can migrate your components, or you can migrate your application to components. You can do all that without doing anything special, just upgrading. Then later on, you can do these other things. You can add Angular, you can add the adapters, you can migrate your code, and you can kind of sit in that bucket for a while. And when you're done with that, finally you can get rid of Angular 1. So this is an incremental process. So update to UI router 1.0. UI router 1.0 offers some huge improvements in the API and capabilities. Primarily the transitions, the transition API, transition hook API, which is those lifecycle events that I was telling you about. And another one that's important to us is route to component. So the difference is between one of the biggest differences, one of the breaking changes in between the UI router that you know and the 1.0 version is that we've actually deprecated the state change events. And that might sound a little scary, but we've replaced it with this other thing that's way, way better. Also, I wrote a compatibility layer that uses the 1.0 transition events, and it emulates the state change events. So don't worry about upgrading. You can use this emulation layer as a crutch. But I think once you start using the new transitions API, you'll prefer it to the scope.on state change start, comma, I think you'll prefer it to that. The problems with the events that we ran into there's actually quite a few of them. Some of those are that the events are disconnected from each other. It's hard to capture a state change start and then a state change success and make sure that it's the right one. Sometimes things get lost. There's no continuity there. There's no support for async. So like you can't listen to a state change start, go out and do something, and then come back and allow that transition to continue. You have to stop that transition in its tracks if you want to do anything asynchronously, if you want to fetch something from the server. So that's a problem in the 0.2.x line that we addressed. So these hooks in 1.0, this is actually $transitions service. That's the new API for transition hooks. It allows your application to hook into these lifecycle events while the transition is going through the pipeline. It's completely asynchronous. It's promise-based. And it supports things like, we have first-class support now for redirecting, which I know is a common use case that a lot of people have had difficulty figuring out the right way to do it. Now that's baked in. So let's talk about the transition hooks. And I was gonna do I don't know if I should do this. I was gonna do a live demo of the sample app. And I put these links on here for anybody who's got their laptops, and if they want to follow along, there's a couple of things that you can see at these links. The first one is the actual UI Router 1.0 sample application. And it's got a couple whiz-bang features that you might find interesting. We tried to make it a little bit more real-worldy than the last sample app, which is kind of meh. And then the second link is actually, I went through the process of upgrading a portion of the sample app to Angular 2, because of course we're doing this incrementally, right? And so on that second link there, you can look at all of my commits over time that I took in order to do this process. And as I was doing that, I was building the tools that make that possible. So you'll see from the application's perspective what an upgrade would look like over time. So let me talk about transition hooks. Transition hooks are applied to a transition, but only if that transition matches the hook's criteria. So the hook says, hey, I want to intercept a transition, but only if these things are true. And those things could be, I only want to intercept a transition if it's going to this destination state. The destination state might be like bank account or something, and you want to make sure that they're authenticated. So you put a hook on that, and you say the to state is bank account. You can also have have it be off of the from state. So you want to always do something when they're leaving some state and going somewhere else. So let's say I was leaving my bank account state and going to my profile state, and I always want to log when these people leave this protected area. I could do it at that time by having a transition hook that checks for a from state bank account. We can also do this on entering and exiting, which is a bit different than to and from. Because we think of our application as a tree of states, when you transition from one nested state over here to a nested state over here, you're actually exiting a bunch of states and then entering a bunch of states. So you can capture, or you can match a criteria based on that. And you can use that to do things like protect an entire module. Instead of just the bank account state, you might have a banking module. And what you can do is you can say, I want to intercept a transition where I'm entering banking. And then banking will be protected. Banking.account will be protected. Banking.account.ledger, etc. Because that top level state is always going to be entered. You can also do the same thing with exiting.
Hey, Chris, I added these comments to the comment section, or these links to the comment section of our meetup tonight.
To the comment section?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
So if anyone wants to just go and click on them, go to our meetup page for tonight's event.
These transition hooks are asynchronous, they're promise-based. To go without saying, some of the things that they can do is they can, oh, by the way, let me back up a sec here. These declarative hooks, you can put a state name there. You can use a glob, so you can say star dot something dot star, whatever, and we'll do some glob matching against the state names. You can also use a function, and I'll show you why using a function is really interesting. So what will happen is, like, let's say that we're going to start a transition to banking, and you've got a transition hook, and that hook is a function. It has a function for the criteria. It's going to pass the to state into that function, and then you can check the to state. You can programmatically check what stuff is on there, and you can return true or false. And based on that, your hook will either be applied to that transition or will not. All right, moving on. We'll get to that. So one of the things that's interesting about transition hooks, what do you got? Yeah.
Yeah. So even, you mentioned that if you're going from one state to another, it's basically traversing up the tree and then coming down.
Correct.
Is that the case in the 0.0 as well?
That is the case in 0.0 as well. The transitions go up the tree and then back down. Yes.
So when we have the state change event, is it getting triggered for every state it's leaving?
The state change event is a transition level event. So that triggers one time, no matter how many states you exit or enter.
Okay.
And that's the same for the transition on before, etc. That's a transition level hook. Yep. Next screen. So transition hooks. I told you that a hook matches the criteria. It can be a function. So you can match specific types of transitions and your application behaviors. They can become really declarative, which is nice. I like declarative programming a lot because it moves the code out of the way. You don't have to think about how things are happening. You just say, I want it to do this thing, and it does this thing. So in this case, we have a transition hook that we started here. This is the criteria. This is how I specify the criteria for this declarative hook. And I just made this one up. It's called redirect to. I stick it on my state. So now my state has a property called redirect to. This is a peer to the other things that typically live on a state, like name, URL, controller, template, etc. So that lives on that state as a piece of data. That piece of data has a string in it, and it says mymessages.messageList. You can see that my messages state's name is my messages. So let me show you what the actual hook implementation looks like. So up here, we have the match criteria. Second, below that, we have the actual function that, oh, darn it. Okay, here we go. So what we're doing is we're declaring a global behavior for our application here. We've got this transition service that we're injecting, Angular 1 style. We've got the match criteria, which has a property on it called to. The value of that property is a function, just like we talked about. So whenever a transition happens, it's going to pass this hook the to state. And now my hook can introspect that to state and say, does this match my criteria or not? And my criteria, as you can see, is state.redirectTo is not equal to null. So it's going to trigger any time that the to state has this metadata on it. When it triggers, the actual code for it, you can see below there, redirect function. What it does is it grabs the to state, it checks, it introspects it, pulls off the redirect to metadata, and it returns a new target state. That's that last line in the function, return state.target new state, and then it passes the parameters and the options. That gets returned, and then that entire transition is redirected to my messages.list, which we declared as data. So the ability to declaratively define application behaviors, I believe, is a really powerful feature. We've got another transition hook here. This one is actually something that a component has defined. And basically, this component is saying, hey, I'm alive. I know that because I was instantiated. So I registered this hook. Anytime there's a transition that's going to kill me, let me step in for a sec here. So the match criteria is exiting, and the value is this.state. So it's basically saying anytime my state's about to be exited, let me know about it because I got something to say about it. So when that happens, it's going to invoke this.ui can exit, and this.ui can exit basically checks if the data that belongs to that component has been modified or not. So we made a copy of it. We're going to check if it's dirty. If it's dirty, I'm going to pop up a little dialog to the user that says, hey, this is dirty. Are you sure you want to exit? And that happens as it's a promise-based thing. So I say, I'm going to return a promise for that. And that's the bottom line there. It says, return this.dialog service.confirm message, question. If the user answers yes, my dialog service returns true. It actually resolves a promise to true. If the user says no, then it rejects that promise. If it rejects that promise, the transition is canceled. Now this is like 2 seconds later, however long it took the user to decide and click. So we have asynchronous hooks available for us. It pauses the entire transition to wait for that thing to happen. And again, this can be a very powerful thing. We actually added this UI can exit hook as built into UI router. So now your components can just say this.ui can exit is equal to a function that does stuff. It'll get called anytime that component's about to be destroyed. Very similar to, if anybody's used the component router in Angular 2, it's very similar to router can deactivate. Next slide. So we're updating UI router to 1.0. Some additional changes that are important to us for this talk. In 0.2.x, all we had for defining views was a template plus a controller. That's all we could do. We had to stick that on our state definition, or we had to stick that in the views block on our state definition. So in 1.0, we have a slightly nicer thing where we can actually, we still have the template and controller, but we can also route to components. We can do that in 2 different ways. One is with a route to component template, which I'll get to, and the other is this component property on the state definition, and I'll get to that as well. And remember, during our transition, which we consider atomic, one of those things that we support is the resolve block. The resolve block is should be used for fetching data. It has been abused to do a lot of other things, but it should be used for fetching data. And it should be used for fetching data that wants to participate in that transition atomically. So we have this data theoretically in our app that came from a resolve block, but now I've got route to component. I need a way to get that into the component. Let's take a look at the difference between Angular UI router 0.2 and 1.0. And I'm sorry, it's kind of covered up a little bit, but on the bottom, on the left, you can see we've got template, we've got controller, and we've got controller as. On the right, all we have is component, and what is in that variable is just the name of the component. So it's the directive name, as camel case. So let's talk about migrating our app to components. Well, migrating your view code to Angular 1.5 components, it might be really easy for you, but it might be really difficult depending on how well written your application is. And what I mean by that is you might have a bunch of scope soup where, early on in Angular, it was very typical just to go out to scope and put everything on there and grab things from way up above and to put things down there that you expect somebody else to maybe grab. So that's scope soup, where just everything goes in this big jumble. And that can be really difficult to maintain, but also to refactor to components. Another possibility is if you have bloated controllers. So we're going to migrate from component. We're coming from template, ng controller, controller at scope, directives required, link bind controller, to the component API, which we just looked at. template controller bindings are required. And I've got a helpful blog post here that I will also link at the end. And this is actually a really, really long blog post. And this guy talks about a lot of different ways that Angular is currently written and the approaches that you might take to refactor that to a dot component. So check that out. I'll have those links up at the end. There's some things that we don't want to migrate. We don't want to migrate anything that directly manipulates the DOM. We don't want to migrate anything that any directives that we access or that we declare using an attribute. So you can see here, foo, my attribute. That doesn't need to be migrated because it doesn't have a template. Anything that doesn't have a template can't be a component because a component has a template. One example of a component that doesn't have a template that you're probably familiar with is UI-sref, which is a link generator for UI router. There's no component there. All it does is add a click handler and call state.go. So otherwise, if your component is really advanced, complicated, if it uses compile, if it uses priority or terminal is true, it's probably not a candidate to be refactored immediately to a 1.5 component. Sorry, I'm gonna have to here. Where am I? I want to be at route component template. All right. So the first thing that's new in UI Router 1.0 is this route to component template support. This is something that we actually copied from ng-route in Angular 1.5. So what this route to component template allows us to do is just write a template that uses a component inside of that template and make its and do its bindings to this $resolve dot something. So what we've done is we put the resolve data on scope and we've called it $resolve. Very simple, very trivial thing, but it allows us to do this. You can also, of course, you can route to a standard directive as well. It doesn't have to be a component. Let's take a look at the route to component state on the left. And we can see on the right, we have our component. On the left, we have our state definition. You can see the resolve is called contact. Maybe you can't see that, I don't know. And then our template says edit-contact. And it's passing in pristine contact is equal to $resolve.contact. So we're mapping the contact resolve to the pristine contact binding on the component. And we're just doing that via a template. And we're assuming that $resolve.contact will have our data in it, and it will. The component itself has our binding that we talked about earlier. And that binding is an input binding, and it's a one-way binding. You can see all that up there. It has a reference to a template and a controller. The second way that we can route to a component in Angular, in UI Router 1.0, is to use this component : that we saw. I think we saw an example of this earlier. And then the value of that component contact component is just the name of the directive. So that could be a string that's the name of the directive. There's a reason I put a variable there, which will maybe become clear later. In my actual component class, the first thing that I do is I export the name of the component. I import that in my state definition file, and then I can just use it as a reference instead of having the string duplicated over and over and over. That's why I'm doing that. So you can see that I didn't have to specify how the data got from the resolve into that binding. What it does is it checks the component's bindings object. It sees that there's one called contact. It sees that there's a resolve called contact, and it just puts them together. So that's kind of like auto binding version. Another thing that we can do is if the names don't match up, we can specify the mapping manually. And you'll see that on the left, that's in the state definition. We can say, I've got a pristine contact binding, map that to the contact resolve. So you can see the arrow showing how the contact resolve is mapped to the pristine contact binding. So those names might match, they might not match up because you might be mapping it to a resolve that comes from a parent state, for instance. So next up, let's add Angular 2. Let's pretend that we've gotten over this 1.5 component migration. Our app looks great. It's a bunch of components. And now we think of our applications view as just a bunch of independent components which are composed to build our entire application. Now we can bring Angular 2 into the mix. So Angular 2 works best if you have a module loader. I highly recommend writing your applications using JavaScript modules. Not to be confused with Angular 1 modules, which I said are terrible. So when we're using a module loader for JavaScript, we avoid script tags in general. And we don't put all of our scripts in the index.html, for instance. We don't just concat and minify them all together. What we do is we write a application bootstrap, that's JavaScript, and that bootstrap imports the sub-app dependent modules that it might depend on, and that module depends on some other code, and it imports it. And based on that, we recursively build this module dependency tree, and then we rely on the module loader to know what to do with all that. Forgot to push that button. So in ES6 and TypeScript, the way that we have a module that says I need something else from somewhere else is you use import. We import something from some other file, relative path name, usually. In CommonJS, we use require. There's a function that's just placed on the window scope that's called require. In the same way, we say require some file, and it will load that module, and it will give you whatever is in that module. There's a whole lot of magic involved there. So now you've got, you're writing your JavaScript code as modules, but you need a way to load them into the browser, do all the module loading magic, and perhaps even bundle them. So a module loader system, it registers those JavaScript modules, one file per module. It loads them, and it provides them to other JavaScript files that may be saying that they depend on them. So that imports something from something. The module loader takes that and figures out where to get the something. That's basically what it does. It's really more complicated, but that's basically what it does. And a bundler walks your dependency tree, the individual source files, and it concatenates and it does all that stuff, but it does that within the context of a module system. So it gives you that capability at runtime to do import this from that, and it will figure out where to get it from. So choose a bundler or module system that works for you. I recommend these ones. System.js is the one that the Angular 2 team is officially recommending. Yes?
That's a quick question.
Yeah.
At what size of app does it make sense to for sure move over this? Like, are there apps that are small enough that you can just smash them all together and load it when the user loads the first page?
To not use a module bundler?
Yeah, like, at what point is it like, well, you're only doing X lines of code, just load them and skip this altogether?
I'll give you my opinion. There's going to be other opinions. My opinion is that if you have more than 2 files, I would personally use a module loader. The reason for that is because it allows you to separate the code out and not just like throw things on the global window. That's going to become more important when we're not doing Angular 1, which actually has its own module system, right? So once we're into Angular 2, the module system becomes more important because we don't have the crutch of the Angular module system to fall back on. In other words, what we might typically do is have a bunch of scripts in our index.html. Each of those scripts registers an Angular module and registers its components against that Angular module. And then we do the bootstrap later, and Angular just goes through and figures all that stuff out, right? So we kind of, now that we got rid of that non-standard system, we need to pick a standard system to use.
Why do you like Webpack more than development and all that?
Those are different concerns, actually. Webpack does replace a lot of what Grunt and Gulp does, but I'm referring to it here more in the context of the module loading capabilities. So it's going to do the CommonJS analysis, and it's going to figure out how to wire those things through there. It's the wiring through that's important. It's not the concatenating and minifying. Yeah.
So in System.js, you still, I've seen, I still have to add those modules under the System.js configuration.
You have to add the modules?
Well, if I'm using Power or with Wiredep or something, it was automatically injected.
Yes, I know what you're talking about. In System.js is it doesn't know how to traverse, let's say, a package.json or a bower.json. So it doesn't know what the main file is. All it knows is if you tell it you want some path, it's going to go fetch that path and load it. There are other things that you can put on top of System.js that does that sort of wired up kind of capabilities. And one of those things is the second one, it's JSPM. That stands for the JavaScript Package Manager. So it's a package manager, and it builds the config.js for you. It builds the System.js config for you. And the System.js says, if I ask for Angular, you actually go to Angular/lib/angular.min.js or whatever. So there's workarounds for that. System.js on its own is not concerned with that sort of problem. So you have to use the config. Any other questions?
All right. I'm playing with Webpack now.
Yes.
Fun.
Yes.
It's great for bundling my TypeScript together.
Mhm.
But then it has all these other dependencies. Should I be using Webpack to bring all those other like the Angular dependencies, or should I be using System.js? What do I do for all the other dependencies?
Do you have a comment about this?
Observation on it, because I've been really into JSPM the last couple of weeks.
Okay.
And like, I have gotten to where I create the whole bundle for my app, where I say JSPM bundle and I point it at my app. And now that it's written in ES6 and imports all the things where it needs them, it runs the dependency graph, it builds the thing, and it'll create one JS file with the whole smash.
And mine's like 5 megabytes.
Oh boy.
Sure.
Well, because it's not minified. It's pulling in, which,
JSPM can minify.
yeah, I can.
JSPM can also do bundle map. So now you can start to subtract things out. You can say, like so I can build it and say, I want to build my app and I want to subtract all of my application files, which leaves me only my dependencies. The things like Angular, the things like that.
And those are chunks.
Those are chunks,
They're
yeah.
chunks.
And then I can turn around and build another bundle that's just my app. And I can see where you could probably carry that even further and start to build sub-bundles and then load those as needed. So I think there's a lot of possibilities.
I mean, there's definitely
There are lots of
Okay.
possibilities.
Yeah.
too many possibilities.
That's the state of JavaScript, to be honest.
Okay.
All right, I need to move on because
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
I'm running out of time here. So we need to, we're adding Angular to our application. So we're updating our package.json. I'm just going to assume you have a package.json because you really should. So get a package.json, put these things in it. And then if you do an npm install, you'll have all these things downloaded to your local system in your node modules, etc. Then we're going to install these ng2 libraries, the ones that we just fetched. We're actually going to use them. I told you not to use script tags, didn't I? Use script tags. I don't know why, but the Angular team says you got to use script tags for these in the exact order. I suspect that's something that has to do with the beta. I suspect that'll change in time. I don't really know the answer to that. I'm just following instructions. So you're going to add these to the top of your HTML. You can see I'm using System.js. You can tell that just by convention. There's a config.js there that I'm including. And I'm using system.import. And then I'm importing the bootstrap for my application, which is a small little file that imports the rest of the application. So yeah, go ahead.
This is a quick question. If it hasn't been made obvious to most people, this is where you make your node modules public, where you would normally make it public on a build cycle that was previously just bundling. But I have a question for you because I've started moving over to JSPM2, which has a different solution. But in this situation, if you have a build cycle that you're also doing, all your grunt and gulp libraries and all that stuff are on your node modules too. And so you're exposing that your entire node modules.
What do you mean by exposing?
Well, I mean, they're going to be.
You mean on the public web server?
Yeah. And I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it just seems counterintuitive that all the server code is now.
I guess I wouldn't make that assumption, that those are actually being bundled, or that those are actually being published onto the website. In fact, this is kind of a naive thing to do. This is for a sample app. I would probably, in my build setup, I would move these things into an appropriate place. Then I would publish those as part of as a deployable.
So, how would you go about tracking that then?
What do you mean tracking?
Well, right now you install it in your package JSON. That's how you know you want Angular. It's installed in your node module.
Yes.
But in JSPM, it's installed in your JSPM package.
Which is all my front end stuff. There's nothing back end that's in my JSPM, so I don't have to worry about that. You know.
You could just do you could just do a post install script on your package JSON to move specific files after an npm install. I think this is just like kind of a sample, but like you said, it's like a sample app. Like you wouldn't actually want to publish, you know, a URI to your node modules and host those on your application server.
I wouldn't think you'd want to. That's why I asked the question. Because every example has the same setup.
Let me put it this way. If I were going to deploy this to a production environment, I would bundle all these things together, and I would deploy a bundle for this setup. Then I'd use a script tag to load that bundle in. I would concat and minify these ones. I wouldn't do the whole ES6 blah, 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 because these are all individual modules already. Just concat them down into a file, deploy that. That's what I would do.
So I was using the Angular's Ember CLI
Yeah.
with Broccoli or something like that.
Yeah.
In that Ember CLI configuration, it moves node module packages into a distribution folder. I don't know if anybody has used the Ember CLI, but that's the default Angular generator that they're advertising.
Yeah, I can't comment on the Angular CLI because I haven't used it yet. I have heard comments that it is still very much a work in progress. So I wouldn't assume that anything you're seeing now will be the final behavior. I don't know. That's the answer to that one. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're getting into the blurry text. Come on, hello. Can you guys see that? Is that super blurry or is it just me? Okay, I guess you can read it. This is the part where we're actually getting into the crux of the talk. And the crux of the talk is these adapters that will allow us to run Angular 1 and Angular 2 code simultaneously. So the two things that we're going to wire up here are the Angular 2 upgrade package, which is, again, that's actually included in the regular Angular repo. It's not a separate repo, but it's not included in the default build. So we have to add it in there. The other thing that we're going to include is the UI router upgrade adapter, and that's from the npm package UI router ng1 to ng2. So what we do is just create a new instance of the upgrade adapter. That's the first two lines that you see there. The next two lines, we supply the upgrade adapter to the UI router adapter. And UI router is going to do some things. It's going to put some things into the DI tree. And then I'm registering some services down here. That comes later. And then at the very bottom, I wish you could see this. You can't see this. It says upgrade adapter.bootstrap document.body demo. Demo for demo app. So that's just like angular.bootstrap document.body demo, but we're using the upgrade adapter instead. So a lot of your apps, you might have an ng-app tag in there. That ng-app tag calls angular.bootstrap, and it does this bootstrap process. In order for the upgrade process to work, we have to strip that ng-app tag out and replace it with this upgrade adapter.bootstrap. It's just a requirement. You just got to do it. So we are all wired up and ready to go. Next thing we're going to do, now's a good time to mention. We're about to migrate our Angular 1.5 components to Angular 2 components. But now's a good time to mention that you could skip that whole process. You could get to this point where you just have, you have URL 1.0, you have Angular 1.5 or whatever, you put this Angular 2 stuff in there, and instead of going from your Angular 1.0 code to a 1.5 component, you could just go right up to this Angular 2 component. You could skip that whole intermediate process if you wanted. Might be a little bit riskier, I don't know, whatever. That's not my decision to make. I just wanted to mention that you could do it. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our first ng2 component. We're going to migrate our contacts component from a 1.5 component style with the bindings to a Angular 2 style at component. And I'm using TypeScript, and you should use TypeScript too, but if you don't, there's other ways to specify this. That was supposed to be funny. So the add component, that's the top line. We have a selector, even though UI router doesn't really need a selector because we're not going to put this as a tag into our app. We're going to do the component colon thing in the state definition to declare it. It's got a template. I haven't changed the template yet. I just put it in there. We'll change it later. And then I specify this set of directives. This is Angular 2 kind of stuff. You have to specify any directives that you're going to use in your template. You have to specify in this directives thing in order for Angular 2 to wire everything together. And inside of the directives array is just a list of classes. That list of classes are directives that then apply to your template. Otherwise, it'll just ignore them or throw an exception.
So by directive there, you mean like the attribute type of directives?
No, I mean directives and components. So I believe there's an inheritance that goes on there. One of them inherits from the other. I believe a component inherits from a directive. Yeah, I think that's the way it is.
Isn't the child component included as a direct?
I don't know. So you can see that, so that's kind of some of the boilerplate. We have to make sure that we tell it what directives we're going to use in our template. We give it the template. We give it a selector. In ng2 land, the selector means this is the name of the tag that I want you to apply this directive to. And then on the bottom, you can see we've got a class that we're actually exporting. Remember I said that you have to supply a directive class to this array, this directives array. You have to put a directives class in there. Well, this is a directive class that we could then put into some other components directives array, right? Because it's turtles all the way down. And then I replaced the bindings contacts with @input contacts. And that's a way to specify via an annotation that the contacts field on my class is actually an input. So I want things to be able to be bound to it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to switch to the ng2 style. And surprisingly, not a whole lot has changed. So if we look at what we currently see up there is the ng1 style of a template for this contacts component. And what I've done is I've highlighted the things that are actually changing. So I did a diff line. And you can see this UI minus sref, that changed. In here, we've got an ng-repeat, that's changed. We've got an in $control. Remember, the $control came from our 1.5 controller. We've got another UI sref. We've got a UI sref active. And nothing else has changed. We've got this UI view down here. That didn't even change. And I'll show you why that is. So I'm going to toggle this over to the ng2 code, and we'll see what's changed. So instead of our UI-sref, we have a UI capital S ref that's capitalized. Why is it capitalized? Well, that's what I was told to do by the Angular people. They said spaces out, or kebab case. They said we use kebab case for components, attributes, let me start over. We use kebab case for a component selector. For attribute selectors, we're using camel case. So UI sref is now UI capital sref. We changed that ng repeat to a star ng4 pound contact of context. Why did we do that? Because that's what the Angular team decided on. We got our UI sref is changed a little bit. Instead of passing in the name of the state and then a parenthesis and then an object that gets evaluated against the scope, we don't do that anymore. Now what we do is we pass in the UI sref. I'm passing in as a string, and now I'm binding UI params, which is a property of UI sref. I'm binding that to this Angular expression. So there's a couple little minor tweaks in the UI router directives that have occurred. UI sref active is pretty much the same thing. It's just changed to camel case. And then our UI view down here, that's the same. I'm going to toggle that back so you can see it. Yeah?
What is the difference between a component router and a UI router? So
that's a big topic. There's we take very different. We have different approaches. The component router is much more dynamic than UI router is. We have a state tree that's kind of static. It's kind of in memory. That allows us to do those things during a transition, treat the whole thing as atomic. It allows us to do a lot of cool things like that. The component router, everything is kind of independent of everything else. So you can basically place any component as a child to any other component just by adding a route definition to it. So that's the primary, I think that's the biggest philosophical difference between UI router and the component router. Another interesting little bit to note is that in UI router, a state knows what its parent is, whereas in the component router, a component knows what its children is. So those paradigms are kind of flipped a little bit. So we are migrating to ng2 components now, right? Bottoms up. We are going to use a bottom-up approach. The reason and the caveat for that is, and by bottom up, I mean we're going to attack our leaf nodes first. So we've got this big tree. We've got components that are attached to that tree. The leaf nodes are the ones that don't have a UI view inside of them. That's what I consider a leaf node. So let's convert those to ng2 components first, and then let's move up to their parent. Let's convert that to an ng component. That parent may have a UI view in it, right? Cool. That works just fine. The caveat and the reason for that is that the ng2 UI view currently can't render an ng1 template and controller combination. So you couldn't switch from ng2 down into ng1 via a UI view. Can't be done. So as you're migrating components, you're going to move up the tree and migrate one at a time. And finally, we'll get up to the parent component. What does that say? Use ng2. Oh yeah. So we're going to use the new ng2 directives instead of the ng1 version. We're going to use other ng2 directives wherever possible, and we're going to use Angular. We're going to use an Angular upgrade adapter if we need to temporarily upgrade an Angular 1 directive to an Angular 2 directive. We can do that as long as it's a component. We'd like to avoid that if at all possible. So when we're writing to the Angular 1 component, we use the component name, remember, in our state definition. In Angular 2, we're going to use the class reference. And you can see that highlighted here. This capital C is indicating that that's a class. So in my state definition, I'm going to say component colon and then the class name. And that means that this state's view is bound to that component. Whereas over there, this is the name of the components of the context directive. It's just a string. This one's a class. That's the difference. If I hadn't changed that C to a capital or lowercase, then my state definition wouldn't have actually changed at all. but I like having a capital C because it's a class. Directives and services. So you're going to have to rewrite your attribute-based directives. Things like in UI router, we've got UI sref active. You're going to have to rebuild those from scratch as an ng2 directive. Your services, most of that's going to port over pretty well, I think, as long as it's like pure Java code or JavaScript code. But the details for doing these migrations are, let's go for this talk. It's actually, we're getting pretty late here, so that's a good thing. So we're done. We've migrated our, we've got ng2 in there. We've got our upgrade adapter. We've migrated all of our directives to directives, all of our components to ng2 components, and our services to services. So what do we do now? Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to get rid of the ng upgrade bootstrap, and we're going to do a full-on Angular 2 bootstrap to load our application. We're going to remove the UI router adapter. We're going to remove the Angular upgrade adapter, and we're going to remove the ng1 version of UI router. The ng2 version was in there. I missed a step. I forgot to tell you about that. But UI router-ng2 is the ng2 version of UI router.
Written in TypeScript.
It is written in TypeScript.
But are there any extra steps that you need to cover? Install the types of it?
Yes.
Typings?
The typings, UI router is using the new standard TypeScript typings mechanism, where if you do if you're installing into Node modules, your IDE is going to find those typings for you. You don't have to do anything special. If you're using WebStorm, if you're using Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, Atom, and what's the Atom called? Or the, I don't know, there's no, I don't know. There's, if it supports TypeScript, and the TSC, the standard command line compiler, it also knows how to find those typings directly out. You don't have to do anything. You just import from double quotes UI router-ng2, and it will suck in those typings. So clean up after yourself. All right, let's review. What's the plan? First, we're going to update UI router, and we're going to migrate our application to ng1 Angular 1.5 components. Second, we are going to add Angular 2 to our application, and we are going to add the ng1 to ng2 adapters, both the Angular one and the UI router one. Number 3, we're going to migrate to Angular 2 services and components. I should probably have directives in there as well, because you have to do that. Finally, we're going to clean up after ourselves, get rid of all the ng1 code. The title of the talk said Big Bang, so what's Big Bang? Well, Big Bang is you just rewrite everything. You skip half of that stuff, but you don't have a working app until the whole thing is done, right? So the difference in the approach is that you're going to actually start, instead of bottom up, you're going to start top down. So you're going to skip all that hybrid stuff. You're going to rewrite all your services, and you're going to start at the top component in the tree and get your wrapper working. And then you're going to upgrade the next component going down until it's all done. Some of your old code can be reused. Most will be rewritten. Some of the stuff that you can reuse is probably your state definitions, your services, and most of your templates in the structure, like the HTML structure. Rewrite the low-hanging fruit, like services, and things that should obviously be ng2 components, and keep adding in the migrated components until the whole thing is done, and then ship it. If you see that link there, that's actually a quick start for UI router ng2. That's on the links page at the end of this. We're done. I've got code behind all of this stuff. I want to make that clear.
One thing you didn't talk about is testing.
I didn't talk about testing. That's a good point.
So what happens to your tests? Is that another big bang?
That's a huge bang, yeah. Yeah. And to be honest, I haven't done that. So I don't know what's involved, but I know that it's quite different. Now, if you were using end-to-end testing and clicking elements and that kind of stuff, hey, maybe that stuff still works.
Okay, but for your unit testing, it's back to square one.
It depends how different it is. So like you've got a component, that component has a code behind it. If that code is similar to your old controller, maybe some of that can be reused. It's going to be very different though.
All right, so I'm in big bang mode right now.
Oh boy.
Okay. Well, I've used UI router. I'm going to Angular 2. Why do I still want to use UI router? How is it better than what they're shipping now as the router in Angular 2?
I suggest that you try them both and come to your own conclusion. The component router, it's a really interesting piece of software, but it's still trying to figure out what use cases people are trying to solve. So it works well for what it does. There's some holes, there's some gaps in the functionality for a lot of use cases. I think it's a really clever piece of software, but is my mic out? But
It's good.
I'm really fond of UI router. I think the state tree concept and the atomic transitions and the declarative behaviors is really a big win for building robust apps.
Is it ready to start building the beginnings of a real app?
It is ready to start beginning. It's alpha software.
It's alpha.
You understand that,
Yep.
but it's ready.
Okay.
The sample app is proof of that, and I think it's going to be near final when Angular 2 is final. That's my goal.
You mentioned that upgrading to UI Router 1.0 had some deprecations in it.
Yeah.
And I've been working on that for about a year now, and I don't know if we've upgraded UI Router since we started the app.
Right.
So when you say deprecations, are there any breaking changes?
Yes.
Or are we talking about like deprecation warnings?
There are breaking changes. There's a list of breaking changes if you go to the UI Router GitHub. The breaking changes, most of them are really minor. But the biggest one is going to be those state events. Those are gone.
Could you elaborate more on that? Because I know like in the app that I've worked on, we have a couple of events that happen on like state change success.
Yes.
For instance, so like how would you replace that?
You'd replace that with the $transitions.onSuccess.
Okay.
It's as simple as that.
I think you talked about services moving into NG2.
Yes.
And I've seen NG2 has all these observables things
Yes.
going on, where NG1 I didn't see any of that. So, and is that going to be as simple as moving, or do you have to put in observables?
You don't have to use observables. Most of the API is not going to force you to use observables. If there is an API that has an observable on it, you can call that toPromise on it, and you can use it as a promise-based API. So it's not something that takes over all of your services. You can code your services the way that you want to. It's an opt-in thing, the observables.
$HTTP is going to be
Yes,
observable?
that's correct. HTTP is going to be observables-based. But again, you can just call that toPromise on it.
What would I think I know the answer to this, but would you recommend a bottom-up approach to transitioning over a top-down approach to transitioning? Like over a big bang? Right?
I'm going to say I think they're both useful approaches. The reason I'm recommending a bottom-up is because I haven't written the top-down adapter. I would say if they're both available, I would combine them, whatever feels best for whatever you're going to be more productive in. They're both acceptable approaches. Yeah. Any other questions? It's getting kind of late here. Sorry to keep you guys.
Phenomenal talk, Chris. Thank you. So before we go, I'm going to do the giveaway for the JetBrains license and the 2 front-end master's licenses, and then I'll let you guys out of here. And I did post the link to Chris's slides in the comment section of tonight's meetup too, so you guys can go and get all these links that he has up here. And like I said, we did do a screen share for the live stream, so you can rewatch all of this. I did check it out on my phone, and it's very readable, and the audio is clear. It's a big improvement from our former live stream. Switch over to Prizatron, and I'll do the last couple giveaways. Just gonna pick up where we left off. Can't do any more shames tonight because some people did leave, but they were here. I don't know who they were, so I'll pick. We have 3 giveaways, actually 4. Had trouble giving away a 4th last time with the plural site, so we might go through that again. All right, so first person wins gets the first pick. Amber Joy, are you here? She might have been here. I watched a couple people leave. We'll just keep going. AP Dodge, are you here? No, might have left. Gerard Maplethorpe. There's like 5 or 6 people that left. So Noah Protzel. Just keep going.
Hey,
James.
it's me.
All right, man, you get first choose. Jeffrey's
Front-end
license.
front-end masters.
One front end. All right, make sure you give me your email on before you leave. I will. So I will put this one back into the community. Colin. Going. Misford. You here? No. Brian Lugan. Artisher, are you here? I think this is the longest list of people that we can't be shameless. Lewis,
We're here.
Yeah, thank you from you.
where are
Is there
you?
another front-end masters?
So we have front end masters or a JetBrains license.
Definitely your license.
You want the JetBrains license?
I didn't take the front. Do you think I took the front-end masters? You can have
Okay.
front end.
Front end.
You want the front end? Make sure you give me your email before you leave tonight. All right, so we have 1 JetBrains license and this 1-month subscription to Plural Site. Karina.
Well,
WebStorm, PHP Storm. All right, make sure you give me your email. I will email that to you. All right, so Plural Site. Hey, right here. Benjamin, I got some cards for you right here. So I don't need your email. And that wraps it up. All right, email address.
I should. So transitions.